I'd like to start today by introducing you to Judith Bucknell. I became familiar with Judy by reading a book by author Max Lucado. Lucado writes that she was homicide number 106 that year. Judith Bucknell was killed on June 9, 1980, 38 years old, 109 pounds, stabbed and strangled. Now, she kept a diary, and had she not kept this diary, perhaps all of her memory would have been buried with her body. But the diary exists, a painful reminder of a lonely life, and it details the pain of loneliness. She writes, "Where are the men with flowers and champagne and music? Where are the men who call and ask for a genuine, actual date? Where are the men who would like to share more than my money, my time, or my food? I would like to have once in my life before I pass through the kind of relationship where intimacy is shared in love." But Judy never did. Judy was not a bad woman. She was not on drugs or welfare. She never went to jail. She was respectable. She jogged. She hosted parties. She wore designer clothes and had an apartment that overlooked a lake. But she was very lonely. "I see people together and I'm so jealous I want to throw up," she writes. "What about me? What about me?" Though surrounded by people, she was an island. Though she had many acquaintances, she had few friends. Though she had lovers, she had little love. Although her body died on June 9th, her heart had died long before, from loneliness. So we're beginning a sermon series this fall called HumanKind.BeBoth. And over the course of this month, we want to talk about the reality that this kind of pain exists in the world. We are human, and humans are complicated. We all have longings and needs, often like Judy's, to be loved or connected, fulfilled, purposeful. But we're also human in that we pursue these things ineffectively. We look for connection in the wrong places. We chase the wrong kinds of love. We love objects, but then use people. It's the reality of a sinful and broken world that we all have needs to be met. And even when our needs are met, we forget to help others in their needs. And even when we do help others meet their needs, we draw all sorts of lines around who we will or won't help. Because being a human is complicated. Which is why we also want to talk about being kind. At the end of the day, we all have needs, wants, and desires. And I want you to know, you will never look into the eyes of someone God does not love. And so in this sermon series, we want to talk about stories where Jesus showed that he understood the complexity and the hurt of our world. He even saw the lines that we draw in the sand. But Jesus didn't let our human brokenness stand in the way of his kindness. And so we hope that we can do the same. Now, our text for today is complex. In the first verses of John chapter 4, we're told that Jesus has his first negative encounter with Pharisees and decides to relocate. So John 4:4 reads, "Now Jesus had to go through Samaria." And this should be our first indication that something else is going on in this story. There's little reason Jesus had to go through Samaria. In fact, most Jewish people avoided Samaria at all costs. You see, Samaritans were detestable to the Jews. Like a brother who betrays the family but wants to pretend nothing is wrong, they are worse than the enemy. And geographically, at the time of Jesus, Samaritans lived in a small place in the middle of the country with Israelites residing all around. So when a Jewish person traveled, it was easy for them to go around Samaria and continue on their way. There is little reason why Jesus had to travel through Samaria. So this is the first time in our story that Jesus encounters the brokenness of being human. These two groups, in their need to be right, have ostracized each other, pushing each other from kin, across political lines, across ethnic lines, to the point where they no longer agree on anything. It is a line they have drawn in the sand. But Jesus so often sees the line, but he follows the need. And so this is the first line Jesus chooses to cross. Jesus had to go to Samaria. And when Jesus arrives, other lines have been drawn to keep people apart, and yet Jesus chooses to cross them. Besides Jesus being a Jew in Samaria, we read that he chooses to talk to a Samaritan, which is a big no-no. He's a man talking to a woman who's not his wife, which is another major faux pas, and he's asking her a question kindly. I cannot impress on you enough how radical this moment is. Jesus has essentially walked into enemy territory, found the least important person, one to whom he as a man should not even associate, and then asks, "Will you share with me?" This is like Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi deciding to have a cordial lunch together. This just doesn't happen. And yet, that's where Jesus had to go. I think there's a couple reasons for this. The first being, Jesus' love knows no bounds. We see a lot of lines being broken down here. There's a political divide, an ethnic divide, a gender divide. And sometimes we still draw those lines today, don't we? And yet Jesus is so radically loving, he walks right across the lines that divide us, as if to say, I will make the choices about who is in and who is out, and I'm willing to go to the least of the least to offer them eternal life. Because that's a major theme of this story. Jesus asks a woman for a drink, but he offers her living water to connect her to eternal life. This is the same living water offered to each of us in the waters of baptism. When we are baptized, God claims us as his own, saying, this is my child in whom I am pleased. I will never stop pursuing this one. If we're to frame it in terms of human and kind, Jesus is effectively saying there is no subsect of human being. There is no line that can be drawn that will keep you from my loving kindness. Jesus sees the line, but he follows the need. Now, I think there's another reason Jesus had to go to Samaria, and that would be this. Everyone needs to be loved. I want to talk more about this woman for a moment. A lot is said about her. She comes to the well at the noon of the day, which is odd because most folks would come early in the morning before it gets hot. But another oddity is this idea of 5 husbands. For a woman to have had 5 husbands should raise a red flag for us. But we need to be careful about reading our own perspective onto this text. Sometimes we think this woman must have been promiscuous or flirtatious, as if she bounces from man to man without a care in the world. But that would have been impossible for her. First-century women had 0 say in who they married or when. A woman's purpose in life was to be married off and to bear children for their husband. And if they could not bear children, they were often divorced. I think it is very likely that this woman was infertile. There are other aspects of this story that point this way. They're gathered at a well, a source of water that's often associated with imagery of new life and new birth. And not just any well, this is Jacob's well. History tells us a great love story is attached to this place. Going to Jacob's well was like visiting Match.com or Tinder. And think, Jesus never rebukes her. At other times when he meets someone in sin, he asks them to go and sin no more, but not so here. I think it's likely this woman has been infertile and as such been rejected not once but 5 times by men and is now likely living in a relative's home as a servant. The local women won't even gather with her at the well for fear of catching her infertility. This woman lives in shame, unable to do the one thing women are supposed to do in life. Now, one of my favorite things about Jesus is that he crosses all of those barriers that we create, but also he reaches right into the worst part of people's lives to touch them and heal them. Go and call your husband, he asks. Jesus is always willing to step into the deepest hurts of our lives to offer healing, comfort, hope, and forgiveness. Somehow, I think Jesus knew this was the spot of most hurt for her because when he touches on it, she realizes she is speaking to someone else, someone more important, someone powerful. She starts asking questions about faith. I know the Messiah is coming, says she. And Jesus replies, I am he. I wonder if suddenly the whole conversation makes sense to her. He's not talking about water, he's talking about eternity. He's not talking about the lines that keep us apart or how or where we worship. He's not even talking about husbands or having children. Jesus is talking about salvation, and Jesus is offering it to her. And so all this brings me back to my point. Jesus had to go to Samaria to show that there is no barrier God's love will not cross. There are people on all sides of the lines we draw who are in need of God's love. The needs of this world are too great for anything less than God's loving kindness. So there are 2 things I hope you take with you today. The first is this: we are all in need of God's loving kindness. Jesus will always step into the deepest hurts of our lives to offer healing, comfort, forgiveness, hope, and salvation. And so if you're listening today and are feeling lost, if you're hurting or confused, alone, afraid, ill, grieving, frustrated, if you feel guilty or ashamed of something that has happened to you or something you have done, please know God's eyes are on you. And the healing, comfort, forgiveness, hope, and salvation of God is here for you. And the other thing I want you to know, in the uncertainty of this world, people need to hear about God's love now more than ever. Our world needs kindness. And the best way to share God's love is to be God's love. And it's going to take all of us to share God's great love with the world. So it is human to put up walls between us. It is human to draw lines in the sand of who is in and who is out. It is human to sometimes react in fear or anger or dismay. It is human to be in need and hurting. And it is human to be in need of God's kindness. So the next time you have a choice between being human and being kind, be like Jesus and be both.